What are the key strategic mistakes most commonly made by corporate directors or owners when working with boards of directors?
An owner may believe that the board should begin managing the business at the operational level.
That is often where managerial chaos begins.
A supervisory board's role is to answer the question of how to make the company better.
The ability to acknowledge and correct mistakes is a sign of a mature board director.
At times, it becomes obvious that the board itself should step down.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. As you know, it is crucial to learn not only from positive cases and best practices, but also to analyze and draw conclusions from specific faults and failures. And indeed, boards of directors are made up of people, and people inevitably can make mistakes that affect the future performance of both the board and the company. That is why Irina Papusha and I decided to produce a series focused on board-level failures, mistakes that directors occasionally make, and to provide thoughtful analysis and practical breakdowns, so this experience can be used as a learning tool. The goal is to avoid learning exclusively from success stories and falling into the trap of survivorship bias.
Good afternoon. On the topic of survivorship bias, let me share a brief example. During World War II, efforts were made to improve aircraft armor. Analysts examined bullet holes on planes that returned from combat and proposed reinforcing the areas where the damage was visible. However, mathematician Abraham Wald suggested a completely different approach. Reinforce the areas where there were no bullet holes, because most likely the planes hit in those areas never made it back to base. By analyzing the aircraft that returned with damage, specifically the areas that showed no damage, they ultimately reinforced cockpit armor and critical sections of the fuselage. After that, the results improved significantly. More aircraft returned safely and more pilots survived. This became known as the survivorship bias effect, when, instead of focusing only on visible outcomes, we need to actively look for mistakes, identify what we do not know, and examine the areas that are not obvious and are rarely shared as best practices. In other words, we must learn from mistakes, preferably from others' mistakes rather than our own, and continuously improve corporate governance standards and practices in order to strengthen businesses.
Irina and I understand that this is not an easy topic and not many corporate directors will be willing to discuss it openly. Why? Because many may fear that such discussions could somehow affect their reputation. However, we believe this is not the case. On the contrary, the ability to reflect on and address mistakes demonstrates the maturity of a professional board director and a willingness to share valuable experience. It also reinforces their expertise, professional integrity, and readiness to serve as a competent board member.
We are genuinely committed to the development of corporate governance in Ukraine and do not want it to acquire negative connotations. Yet such perceptions do arise, often precisely because of mistakes. Today, we would like to discuss a specific case when corporate directors, either at the request of owners or on their own initiative, interfere in the operational management of a business. This most often occurs in boards of companies that are not strictly regulated by law. In other words, we are referring to small and medium-sized enterprises. Such interference can take different forms, from directly performing operational functions unrelated to strategy, to imposing decisions on executive management, or even artificially prolonging the existence of a board in situations where the company is not ready for it, the owners are not ready, or the directors themselves are not prepared. So today, let us examine such situations in order to avoid survivorship bias, prevent negative perceptions of corporate governance, and learn from others' mistakes without creating our own.
As expert contributors, we have invited Antonina Kurets and Roman Yemets. Welcome. Antonina and Roman will help us analyze this case and draw conclusions that will be valuable for all board members.
In your view, what strategic mistakes are most commonly made by corporate directors or owners when working with boards of directors?
Thank you very much for inviting me. The topic is truly highly relevant and it is extremely important to unpack it properly. Let me begin by answering your question directly. In my view, one common mistake on the owner's side is perceiving the board as a decorative element of legitimacy rather than as a mechanism for strategic partnership, where the board is not merely an advisory body, but one that is also empowered to ask difficult and sometimes uncomfortable questions. On the side of corporate directors, there is also a frequent misconception, and I will admit this was once my own mistake, when a director assumes that their role is to support the CEO in running the business rather than to ensure a balance of interests among all stakeholders, which is what we are actually mandated to do. This is often where managerial chaos begins. True maturity lies in the ability to say no even when it is unpopular. That's my opinion.
All right, thank you. I would add that the owner must work on clearly articulating their own mandate and expectations. At the initial stage, it is critically important to understand whether you are personally ready to place your child, your small or medium-sized business, into someone else's hands, and to genuinely listen to what those hands tell you about it, how it should be developed, what to invest in, what to discontinue, and which direction to pursue. Because sometimes the owner does not fully understand whether they need a supervisory board or an advisory board. If the goal is simply to gather experienced professionals around the table, listen to their advice and expertise, and then independently decide whether or not to implement what was heard, that is an advisory board. It doesn't require the same level of formal structure or depth of involvement in the business. Members of an advisory board typically have substantial managerial and life experience. They tend to comment on the process rather than define the outcome. They discuss how things are being done rather than determining where the company is and where it should go. Defining where the company stands and where it aims to go is the role of a supervisory board, with specific strategic steps, defined direction, thorough internal analysis, and a clearly articulated forward-looking strategy. Therefore, the first step for any owner is to clearly understand what type of board they need and for what purpose.
I often joke with my students during lectures that a board without a clear purpose is a sign of, well, we all understand what that implies.
Yes. Corporate directors, from their side, must also devote significant attention to the initial conversations with the owner or shareholders. Because if your motivation is simply that you have completed your training, want visibility, and want to add a line to your CV stating that you sit on a board, this can backfire at an early stage if you choose the wrong owner or the wrong company. You may not fully understand what you are stepping into, beyond the fact that you have formally started somewhere. Therefore, the owner must clearly define what they want from the board, while the corporate director must assess whether they truly share the company's stage of development, the owner's vision, and whether these align with their own strategic values and professional goals.
Let me add another point. Perhaps the most common issue I observe on the owner's side is the desire to fix their business pains through the board. When we speak about SMEs, and today we are specifically discussing SMEs where boards are often established for the first time, owners frequently try to compensate for the absence or weakness of top management. They attempt to resolve issues that have never been properly addressed in the company, missing processes, undefined roles, by shifting them onto the board. However, this is not the prerogative or the function of a board. Owners sometimes expect experienced professionals to become their hands, eyes, and feet within the business. But that is an entirely different role. In such cases, the appropriate solution would be to hire an interim CEO, an interim CFO, or whichever executive function is missing. In fact, I would classify this as overall unpreparedness of the company. If there is no strong top management team and no structural readiness, a board has no real ground to operate on. The company must first go through the necessary preparatory steps. On the corporate director's side, as Roman already emphasized, there is often a strong desire to secure a first board seat, and sometimes a second or third, especially if previous experiences were unsuccessful. In pursuit of that CV entry, directors may do whatever it takes to please the owner, just to be able to claim the role of corporate director in a particular company.
This requires a certain level of professional maturity from a board director, because the dilemma is far from simple. If someone is building a career as a non-executive director and struggles to secure their first appointment, and suddenly an owner expresses interest and the company appears reasonably attractive, recognizable, potentially beneficial for career positioning, it takes real maturity to say, stop, no, to recognize that this could become a negative case and decide not to step into it.
To admit, this is not my case.
And this raises an important question. Is this primarily a matter of insufficient integrity or of insufficient experience on the part of owners or corporate directors?
I tend to see this as a matter of balance. When founders build a business to a certain level and then invite experienced professionals to join the board, both sides typically come with meaningful achievements. When you meet at that level, you are expected to take the next step together. And if, after some time, you realize that the step was the wrong one, there is rarely a single party to blame. Responsibility is usually shared. Perhaps one side did not listen carefully enough, the other did not articulate expectations clearly, someone was in a hurry, someone expected quick results, as if inviting smart people to the table would automatically generate momentum. Even then, the owner may not fully consider what happens next. If a specific function has been fixed, what is the long-term role of the board? If the need is limited to solving one functional issue, that is not a board. That is external consulting or an interim solution. Once the function is resolved, the engagement should logically conclude. If it is truly a board, then the approach must be fundamentally different.
In reality, owners sometimes want oversight, but without resistance or meaningful challenge. And boards, in turn, may want influence, but without corresponding accountability. Until this relationship is properly formalized, with a clear mutual understanding and documented agreements, particularly around defined areas of responsibility, such situations will continue to repeat themselves. Either the board director walks away with a negative experience, or the owner remains unclear about the purpose of having a board at all.
Thank you for raising the issue of accountabilities. It is central to this discussion. In fact, I am gradually becoming an advocate of stronger regulation in the field of corporate governance, because regulation introduces accountability for both parties, and over time it helps establish proper standards and norms. Until that happens, and in the SME sector, regulation is often limited, whether for better or worse, companies must create their own internal rules of the game. Everything needs to be clearly documented: roles, responsibilities, authority, and accountability. This morning, as I was preparing my coffee and reflecting on our discussion, I came up with a simple metaphor. You can use a coffee machine to hammer in nails, turn it into a flower pot, or store water in it for emergencies. But that does not mean it is fulfilling its intended purpose. However, if a coffee machine was purchased as a coffee machine and came with an instruction manual explaining its intended use, it should ideally be used accordingly. The same applies to corporate directors. Independent directors who agree to hammer nails or perform functions outside their mandate are, in essence, undermining their own professional experience and reputation within the field of corporate governance. Because eventually, these cases surface. Owners talk to each other. One might say, "My board does whatever I ask. They're deeply involved in operations, they deliver great results, and they don't cost much. I've built the perfect setup." Another owner hears this and thinks, "Why should I be any different? I want a board like that too." And gradually this narrative spreads across the market, distorting the very understanding of corporate governance. Meanwhile, independent directors who accept such arrangements begin performing hybrid or interim roles, but certainly not those of independent directors in the true sense. Sergey, what do you think?
Absolutely. It also distorts the broader market. Owners begin to expect nearly full-time commitment from a board director, combined with complete alignment and dependence. This significantly impacts the long-term experience of implementing boards. In my opinion, this is a major issue, just as the issue of accountability is. I strongly believe that even boards that might logically begin as advisory should, where the owner is ready, be established as supervisory from the outset. If the owner is not ready, then perhaps it is simply too early to introduce corporate governance at all.
In most SME cases, based on my experience, the initial request is for an advisory board, and almost immediately it evolves into a so-called hybrid structure, sometimes even labeled a supervisory board, but without granting real authority. Decisions are not implemented. They are still treated merely as recommendations. Yet, at the same time, the board is asked to form committees, oversee staff, and monitor performance without being given the corresponding mandate or decision-making power. So, in essence, these are supervisory functions, but without decision-making authority, without real influence over the company, and therefore without accountability. These so-called custom boards reflect on the one hand the market's demand for flexibility, but on the other hand, they significantly distort the understanding of proper governance in line with established standards and corporate governance codes.
Of course, each case may differ. In some situations, a supervisory board is both appropriate and can be implemented immediately. In others, a supervisory board may not be necessary at all. For example, when the owner is also the CEO and intends to remain in that role without delegating executive authority, yet still seeks additional expertise and perspective. In such cases, what is needed is more likely an advisory board, possibly with certain enhanced monitoring elements, but fundamentally still advisory in nature.
Yes, I actually wanted to frame this as a question. Can we somehow influence these early stage mistakes that owners make when introducing a board? How can we help them understand which type of board they truly need, or whether they may not need a board at all, at least not yet?
In my view, this comes down to building a system of meaningful communication with the owner. Because how exactly do you change an owner? Change them into what? This is the person who created the business and brought it to its current level. Are we suggesting that we strip away their entrepreneurial instinct and replace it entirely with systems, procedures, and formal corporate governance structures? To say, you were brilliant at building this, but now forget yourself. Here are the rails, and you must run strictly along them. But rails are meant for a CEO operating within a structured system. If an entrepreneur is forced to abandon their identity and instincts, they risk losing both themselves and the business. Instead, the message should be, your business has reached a stage where it is ready to move further along structured tracks. With your entrepreneurial talent, you no longer longer need to focus on a single railway line within one country. You can start thinking at the level of multiple countries or even an entire region. Or perhaps you have always wanted something more. Maybe in addition to making dumplings, you also dreamed of building guitars. That is perfectly fine. If the dumpling business is already running on rails, then let the supervisory board ensure it stays on track, while you channel your entrepreneurial drive into launching guitars or expanding into a new venture. The board can help evaluate and structure that next move. But again, this requires extensive communication at the very beginning. I will continue to emphasize this point, because it is essential to understand whether the owner may simply be tired of the existing business. Perhaps they no longer wish to operate it actively and instead plan to pass it on to their children, saying to the board, "Here is the company. It will belong to my family in the future. Preserve it and grow it. I expect 15% annual growth and a 20% increase in valuation. Let's go." The owner retains control levers and ultimate authority. The board carries accountability within the defined mandate, provided it operates according to the agreed expectations. And the owner is then free to climb mountains, build guitars, or pursue other ambitions.
Roman, you highlighted something very important. You described a rather unique combination that is particularly visible in Ukraine today. On one side, we have founders with exceptionally strong entrepreneurial instincts, yet often without experience in system-based governance. On the other side, we have directors who possess systemic governance experience, but lack the courage to speak openly and directly with the owner about these realities. Exactly what you're talking about. To say respectfully, you are an outstanding entrepreneur and CEO. You have built this business successfully so far, but expansion, succession planning, and scaling require a different governance model. The real question is whether, at that moment, the owner has the maturity to hear that message, and whether the board has the maturity to deliver it clearly and constructively. And that is precisely where it all begins, with that foundational premise. Because when corporate governance is built on the right foundation, it can truly function as intended. The board becomes effective, directors understand their roles and responsibilities, and the system begins to move forward on well-defined tracks. Thank you for that comment. It genuinely resonates. It echoes personal experience and, frankly, personal pain.
Gradually, the focus of accountability often shifts toward independent directors. So how critical is it when corporate directors themselves do not fully understand their role, functions, authority, and the boundaries of those roles?
Let's be honest, completing a corporate governance course or executive program does not automatically make someone a fully formed board director. Because first and foremost, we enter the boardroom carrying our operational background. And the ongoing development, the commitment to continuous learning, reflection, and professional growth as a board director is something I rarely observe consistently on either side. CEOs may pursue MBAs or executive programs, which is valuable. But what happens afterward? Often there is stagnation. And the issue of board director development becomes painful, especially when we discuss board effectiveness and why directors gradually revert to operational roles. In many cases, this happens because there is an incomplete understanding of the board's role and limited exposure to real examples of how supervisory boards are meant to function. Instead, we start reinventing structures based on our own perceptions, despite the fact that globally recognized standards and benchmarks already exist. Ideally, there would be institutions or professional organizations providing simulations, case-based training, and practical exercises so directors could rehearse and internalize what good looks like. Because many corporate directors genuinely believe that what they are doing is correct, and especially if their experience has been shaped by imperfect market practices. For example, a director with a finance background assumes they must directly oversee or manage the CFO, or someone with an HR background becomes deeply involved with the HR director, diving into operational details, process design, and day-to-day problem solving. It feels natural and comfortable because that is their area of expertise. But at that moment, they cross the line from governance into management, and this is exactly where the distortion of the supervisory board's role begins. In the owner's eyes, it may even seem convenient. If they can act as operational managers, that works perfectly for me. It feels efficient and beneficial, at least in the short term. That is why I believe the root of the issue lies in access to real examples, practical exposure, and clarity around standards. This is precisely why the project led by Sergiy, with Irina contributing her ideas and expertise, is so important. Through initiatives like this, we can surface these difficult questions. At the very least, we can analyze how it is supposed to work. And I am confident that this will prompt many directors to reflect. Where am I today as a board member? Where should I actually be? And what is the true mandate and functional role of a supervisory board?
Colleague, how do you see it? In reality, business owners and entrepreneurs are not necessarily systematic top managers. They are entrepreneurs, and the skill set of an entrepreneur differs significantly from that of a professional top executive who builds and manages systems within a business. In any case, an owner is not an expert in corporate governance. On many matters related to boards and corporate governance, the owner relies on the opinion of the board they have established, or on individual board members who advise them on specific issues. So, if we talk about where the greater share of responsibility lies and on which side there is more fault, owners are always in a hurry. As entrepreneurs, they tend to move fast. Decision made, let's go. But it is precisely the role of the board to slow them down when necessary and to instill a more systematic, rules-based approach that will be essential for building a sustainable governance and leadership system. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. This is a normal market reality. Owners seek to achieve maximum results with minimal losses. Otherwise, they would not have built these businesses in the first place. That is simply the nature of entrepreneurship and the environment in which it operates. And here I fully agree that responsibility lies, perhaps not 100%, but in the majority of cases, with the corporate directors. Returning to the issue of critical misunderstandings about why board members should not interfere in operational matters, I would like to address this directly. Once these informal links begin to form, for example, when a board member with HR expertise starts working directly with the HR director, or when a board member with strategic expertise begins influencing the CEO, particularly if the CEO is not the owner, the proposals put forward by the board member gradually begin to be perceived by the executive team as mandatory. At first, they may not be, but over time, the focus shifts and decision-making authority effectively moves from the CEO to the board member, and so on. At the same time, we have just acknowledged that advisory boards in particular do not bear formal responsibility. As a result, after a year of operating in such a model, where operational and strategic functions become blurred, the executive team gradually stops fully owning responsibility for its actions and decisions. They begin to say, well, the supervisory, or rather advisory board told us to do it, no longer merely advised, but effectively directed. And then, after some time, say a year, the advisory board ceases to exist, yet the executive team's ability to make independent decisions and, most importantly, to take responsibility for them has already eroded. Where does the company go from there? Those executive directors and sub-management leaders who are sufficiently ambitious simply leave the company. They do not need another manager standing over them. Those who are more adaptive but less confident gradually begin to shift into different roles, and there is no guarantee they will ever return to their previous positions. As a result, the company loses the core team that previously drove it forward towards certain achievements and key milestones. In my view, the biggest mistake occurs when board members interfere in operational matters, make decisions that should be taken at the operational level, and then do not bear responsibility for them. In fact, even under Ukrainian law governing supervisory boards, interference in operational management may constitute a legal violation. In sectors where corporate governance is regulated, such conduct is explicitly prohibited. Fortunately, in those industries, the framework generally functions as intended.
I once had a case where co-owners approached the board with a request. The board had been working with them while deliberately maintaining distance from operational management. However, the owners asked whether the board could effectively assume the role of a collective CEO.
That's collective irresponsibility. Yes.
Collective irresponsibility. Yes.
I had another example from my time as a CEO. I reported to a supervisory board. By the third year of my tenure, the pattern was quite predictable. Quarterly report, approval, well done, steady progress. We had delivered positive results for 2 consecutive years, and then for another half year beyond that. At a certain point, I said, I can increase this positive trajectory even further, but I will need additional investment. I outlined a clear plan. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence. The next quarter passed. Again, I raised the proposal again and expanded on it. I assumed perhaps it had not been sufficiently clear. I was 32 at the time, presenting to experienced individuals in their 50s and 60s. I began to question myself. Perhaps the idea was flawed. So I refined and expanded it again. I reiterated the proposal, still silence. Fortunately, I had direct access to the owner, whom I had met only twice in my life, both times very effectively. He happened to be in Kiev. I called him and said, I apologize for reaching out on a Sunday. I understand you are in Kiev for one day. Perhaps we could meet for dinner. We had dinner, I explained the situation and the repeated lack of response. Within the following week, the chair of the board approved everything. Over the next 6 to 12 months, I implemented the plan, and it delivered measurable results.
And the owner was not the chair of the board?
No, he was the owner who had appointed the board and allowed it to operate independently until, at a certain point, I pushed the issue myself without fully realizing what I was doing. Frankly, I did not intend to escalate the matter. I was hesitant. I did not want to push the board or create unnecessary tension. I simply shared the situation with the owner, and it turned out to be an entirely appropriate and constructive step. What was surprising, and then at the same time reassuring, was that I did not receive any reprimand from the supervisory board along the lines of, "How could you go over our heads?" Instead, the response was straightforward. The decision was approved, and I was told to proceed, with the clear understanding that the responsibility remained mine.
Of course, situations vary. When an owner raises a request, it is not always immediately clear whether there is an underlying governance issue. This becomes even more complex when there is more than one owner, each with their own expectations, perspectives on how matters should be handled, and their own understanding of what boards and competent governance actually mean. The key question is, how can this be identified early on so that one can confidently conclude something is not right here? We need to pause and examine this more carefully. And if you are already in such a situation where a board has been established and the owner believes the board should take a hands-on approach and effectively manage the business at the operational level,
including formal protocols and documented decisions. Modern governance practices allow decisions to be made from anywhere in the world with the click of a button. If you vote in favor of a proposal, you may not always be required to provide detailed justification. However, if you vote against or abstain, you should be expected to clearly articulate your reasoning. These explanations and voting rationales create an excellent basis for internal follow-up and constructive homework. For example, I am not prepared to support this decision. I abstain. The natural follow-up question is why? What information is missing for you to make either a positive or negative decision? Ultimately, governance is built on dialogue. Is the issue a lack of clarity regarding what is being requested of you? Let's clarify. We return to the CEO and align with him. Do we all interpret the owner's expectations in the same way? Because you are absolutely right. One owner may be planning to sell the business within a year and therefore prioritizes capitalization. Another may be focused on dividend distribution and therefore needs liquidity. A third may be preparing the business for succession to their children, which implies an entirely different perspective and time horizon. When you have multiple owners, the board must balance these differing interests. Only by clarifying the parameters and consequences of specific decisions can you build an effective working relationship with them.
The issues that reach the board's table can and should be clearly categorized. If a matter affects strategic direction, whether in response to an owner's request, investor confidence, expansion plans, or long-term sustainability, then it falls within the board's remit. In such cases, it is indeed a board-level matter. However, if the issue can be resolved by a functional leader within existing policies, rules, and established guidelines, then the board should not intervene. Often when the board discusses such matters, what actually happens is this. They may refrain from acting because they believe the issue properly belongs to the functional executive. In other words, they consider it not to be a matter for the board's table. They may wait to see whether the CEO resolves it independently. Who knows? That is broadly how these situations unfold, but the key is to clearly delineate every issue that comes before the board. Does it influence strategic direction for which boards are typically accountable, or does it not? Based on that distinction, the board decides whether it should vote and formally adopt a resolution. In my own experience, however, the boundary is not always rigid. Any issue that comes to the table, whether from the CEO or from the owners, is discussed openly. Everything gets placed on the agenda, even minor issues. For example, sales have declined by 5% this season compared to the same month last year. You see what I mean? And then the matter is dissected in great operational detail, how the team is functioning, what HR is doing, and so on. Maybe it's the people, or maybe they left, maybe something else. But that is essentially a functional executive meeting of the company's top managers. It is certainly not the role of a supervisory board.
Well, okay, fine. Now, suppose there is already a misaligned board and an owner who has incorrect expectations of the board. What should board members do if they are already inside that structure? One option is to say, listen, you are expecting something from us that falls outside our mandate. In that case, we should step away. Another option is to attempt to correct the situation by engaging with the owner, to explain, educate, and gradually bring the board's work closer to proper governance standards. What do you think?
May I answer? In many ways, that also answers your earlier question. I strongly advocate for formal documentation, a charter or regulation governing the advisory or supervisory board, where everything is clearly articulated. Its authority, its functions, the responsibilities of board members, the scope of matters reserved for the executive team, and the matters that fall exclusively within the competence of the shareholders or founders. Such a document serves as a practical reference point, allowing any decision or attempted intervention to be tested against a clear framework. Does this fall within the supervisory board's mandate or not? Is it the responsibility of the executive team, or is it in fact a matter for the shareholders' meeting?
I would also like to address this question from another perspective. Based on experience, while boards are composed of independent directors with diverse expertise, there must be a shared and cohesive understanding that the board functions as a single collective body. Because what I have also observed is this: individuals may begin thinking internally, if this particular member is performing well, but the owner is dissatisfied, perhaps one of us is the problem, perhaps removing that one bad apple will make everything work smoothly. Unfortunately, there is a tendency in our culture to look for internal fault rather than address the issue holistically and to avoid a direct conversation with the owner. I have observed this very often. We avoid telling the owner, "You are beginning to expect from us something that we cannot deliver as a collective governing body," or suggesting that we revisit our original agreement, what we committed to at the outset, because what is happening now is a substitution of roles. We are being expected to fulfill obligations that were never agreed upon. In other words, dialogue is missing, and it is the board's responsibility to initiate and sustain that dialogue, first and foremost internally. The board must maintain cohesion and a unified position. This is the supervisory board, this is the CEO, this is the owner, or in some cases, the owner-CEO. In many ways, the relationship should resemble that between two entities entering into a contract. What exactly are we mandated to deliver as a board? What information do we require from the executive team? What information comes from the owners? And what is within our scope and what is not? I agree that documenting this creates a foundation for constructive negotiation. If, however, as Sergiy mentioned, the owner changes their expectations unilaterally, then the board must respond as a single body and conduct the conversation collectively. It should not attempt to resolve the issue internally by assigning blame. Nor should members focus on internal frustrations or speculate about who may have triggered the owner's dissatisfaction. The question is not who failed, who lacked competence, or who may have said something the owner disliked. That internal fragmentation only weakens the institution.
Thank you for raising this point. It highlights a different and very important dimension of the problem. I would like to explore it further. In the United States and in other jurisdictions with predominantly one-tier board systems, independent directors often elect a lead independent director. One of that individual's key responsibilities is to build cohesion among the independent directors so that they function as a unified body. Despite differing views and approaches, there must be a shared understanding of how the board operates, what its objectives are, and how it fulfills its mandate, beyond the broader goals of the company itself. In such circumstances, it is critically important for the board to act with one voice and present a united front. This brings to mind a situation where it may be appropriate for a board to resign. For example, when a company is simply not ready for a board, it does not implement a single recommendation, not even one. A year or more passes and there is no meaningful progress. In such circumstances, the board must recognize that it is merely consuming time, its own time, the company's time, and financial resources, without creating value. If there is no unified position among directors to acknowledge that the board is ineffective in this context, then that itself becomes part of the problem. The board may need to step down and tell the owners, please do the necessary groundwork first, and then we can re-engage. We genuinely want your company to grow. But until you appoint a capable top management team and establish key processes, there is little constructive role for us to play. However, among independent directors, there are often individuals who are not prepared to take such a step. For some, the compensation matters significantly. I have reflected on the reasons why corporate directors are willing to make such compromises. Interestingly, financial incentives appear to correlate more strongly with governance breaches than even the desire to gain experience. I have encountered highly professional individuals serving on boards for the first time who were actually more willing than seasoned directors to step away and say, this company is not ready. We should not force them, nor ourselves. And they left those boards. These were individuals who, in principle, needed that first board appointment for their resume, yet they acted professionally. Conversely, I have seen experienced directors hold on tightly to relatively modest monthly compensation and accept almost any compromise, including engaging in internal blame dynamics of the kind previously described. There were cases of unhealthy situations within boards, even internal divisions. Yet individuals remained attached to their positions. This correlation is concerning because board members should be sufficiently mature that financial considerations are the last factor influencing their professional judgment. Regardless of the amount involved, compensation should never drive such behavior.
I agree. Maturity is a fundamental factor, and there is no substitute for it. In my view, a person who has obtained formal education as a corporate director should, if truly ready for board service, be driven by one core internal motivation. That motivation is the desire to view business life from multiple perspectives, across industries, business models, and bubbles, stepping outside one's own operational silo. To understand that, for example, forecasting t-shirt sales and forecasting fuel volumes in a particular region may both be strategically relevant in different contexts. If a board role does not satisfy that intellectual maturity and professional curiosity, then why pursue it? In such a case, one should step away. If the board is not functioning professionally and does not provide new insight, learning, or meaningful contribution, if the owner signs off on governance documents, then ignores them, changes direction, and informally shifts expectations, and begins pushing directors into operational involvement while expecting passive compliance, maturity means having the courage to say no.
At the same time, there are situations where an owner openly acknowledges weaknesses in the top management team and establishes a board precisely to address that gap. For example, to help ensure that the right people are appointed to key leadership roles. In principle, it is entirely appropriate for the board to support the owner in this regard.
This is a legitimate and often core function of a board committee, appointing rewards. The mandate may cover appointing the CEO alone or, if agreed in advance, extending to the broader top management team. That is fully within the board's competence. However, this does not mean the board should assume the role of an HR agency responsible for end-to-end executive search. Yet in practice,
expectations often drift in that direction.
What is frequently expected is this: not merely that the board will interview a shortlist and provide a final recommendation, but that it will source 10-20 candidates directly from the market, present them, advocate for them, and effectively manage the entire recruitment process. And this dynamic is not limited to executive appointments, it extends to other areas as well. There is also a growing trend of inviting newcomers, meaning professionals without prior board experience, to join boards on an unpaid basis, which raises additional governance and maturity considerations. People join boards with the best intentions, first to gain experience, second to genuinely help the company. And what is most concerning is what happens next. Either owners subtly push them or corporate directors themselves take the initiative to step into operational matters. They are convinced they are acting in the company's and the owner's best interest. They do not perceive this as compromise. On the contrary, they believe they are sincerely helping, without fully analyzing whether their involvement is inappropriate. This connects to another important correlation. It is not only about whether someone joins a board on an unpaid basis, although I have already emphasized that a trial period without compensation should not exceed 1 quarter or 4 months. Beyond that, the dynamic shifts into something unhealthy. But I have observed another pattern. The lower the compensation of a corporate director, the more tightly they tend to cling to the position. By contrast, those who join boards at a high level of remuneration are more willing to resign if governance standards are compromised. For them, it is different. Their higher compensation reflects their reputation and accumulated experience. They clearly understand that if they engage in improper governance practices, it is better to step away. Preserving reputation and professional standing outweighs short-term involvement. Paradoxically, when compensation is modest, for example, 1,000 I mentioned earlier, some directors hold on even more firmly and are willing to accept almost any condition simply to avoid losing the position.
Maturity.
Yes. Let's bring our discussion back to corporate culture and the small violations that owners, board members, or even management sometimes choose to overlook. What should be done in such cases? At what point do we recognize that these seemingly minor breaches are in fact the biggest red flag?
The real red flag is the pattern. If something happens once, someone steps out of line and the issue is immediately addressed. This is not how we operate. This is not what we agreed on. That's manageable. If everyone acknowledges the mistake, and anyone can make one, perhaps it wasn't even negligence, but rather an attempt to do the right thing faster, with good intentions, yet the person misjudged the situation, fine. The issue is corrected, lessons are learned, and the company moves forward. However, When the red flag becomes systemic, when the same issues keep resurfacing, then the board needs to sit down and decide how to eliminate the root cause rather than repeatedly spending time on it. A supervisory board is not there to catalog red flags. Its role is to answer one fundamental question: how do we make the company better? After every board meeting, after reviewing documents or resolving specific cases, we should be able to say whether we have made the company better. If we are constantly dragged into operational matters or forced to deal with recurring red flags, we are not fulfilling our core mandate.
I absolutely agree. Let me reinforce this point. From the perspective of independent directors, first and foremost, there must be alignment among themselves. Second, another important red flag to examine, and in this should be clarified before accepting the role, is the organization's corporate culture. How does the owner or CEO see it? How does he or she envision cooperation between top management and the board? In my experience, I have encountered situations where top management was fundamentally opposed to having a board at all. They simply did not accept the idea of yet another governing body, nor did they understand its purpose. As a result, the implementation of any board decision was significantly slowed down. You end up with an artificial effect. The supervisory board works efficiently, makes well-considered recommendations, identifies priorities, suggests improvements, everything seems structured and sound. Yet the company effectively stands still for 6 months. And only after that does even a minimal shift finally occur. For me personally, this is also a red flag. When the supervisory board does not look into this and fails to ask the CEO or the owner how ready top management is, at least in their view, to cooperate with the board, that is already a warning sign. Of course, the first answer will always be, yes, they are ready because I've decided so. But that should not be the end of the conversation. The board needs to go further. This is where thoughtful, well-structured questions matter. Has the top management team previously worked with boards? Were there any challenges in that cooperation? Do they actually understand what a board is and how it functions? And so on. With the right questions, you can build a clear and fairly objective picture for yourself. There is always a way forward, but only if you have the knowledge to recognize the issue. Without that knowledge, we tend to operate on blind optimism, assuming everything will work out. We accept the role, sign the agreement, take on the obligations, but overlook the human factor. Ultimately, we work with people, governance is people working with people, and in my view, this understanding, this awareness is something that must be strengthened.
The corporate culture red flag, in reality, is probably one of the most critical issues for Ukrainian businesses, not only in terms of corporate governance, but also in terms of entering international markets. Ukrainians are sometimes perceived negatively not only because of stereotypes, such as corruption and related narratives. That is a state-level issue, not a business one. But what is the real challenge in business? It is ethics. Many Ukrainian companies behave unethically in global markets. As a result, investors hesitate to enter and international partners are reluctant to cooperate. This is precisely where boards should have influence. Yet boards themselves often become hostages of the existing corporate culture. When owners behave unethically while dismissing it as it's not illegal, it's just a small thing.
But trust is not built on words alone. Once credibility is undermined, no one will simply take you at your word.
Yes, for them, these are small things. This Ukrainian habit of navigating between the raindrops often works to our advantage. In many situations, it even helps us survive. But when it comes to corporate culture and business ethics, this is exactly what we must consciously learn and transform. Otherwise, we simply will not be able to move at the speed our entrepreneurial capacity actually allows us to, especially when entering international markets. Our business culture itself becomes the bottleneck. But let's move forward. What is the solution? What can we realistically do to improve the situation? What tools can we offer to corporate directors and owners to prevent these mistakes? And how do we institutionalize better behavior rather than rely on good intentions?
If we look slightly into the future, I believe the answer lies more with corporate directors than with owners. Many professionals who have spent years in executive roles and delivered measurable results here in Ukraine already have established reputations abroad, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, especially over the past 3.5 years, and so on. They can become the bridge for Ukrainian owners who either understand the need to expand internationally or genuinely aspire to do so, whether for investment diversification, preparation for foreign partnerships, or attracting international capital. Experienced corporate directors with international exposure are part of the solution. They can join a board and say, this is a strong mid-sized business. After the war, you may actually be better positioned to attract a major investor than large corporations will be. Large companies will need time, months, to reassess strategy, align boards, decide whether to consolidate, restructure, or pursue capital. A well-prepared mid-sized company can be far more attractive for foreign investors, but it must become what investors call bankable. That means operating under clear governance rules and structured management processes. Financial reporting must follow internationally recognizable standards. Functional responsibilities must be clearly defined and properly executed, and corporate governance must be structured with a board composed of qualified individuals, clear roles, accountability mechanisms, and professional oversight. If they are truly prepared, independent directors can often provide owners with more clarity than owners expect from themselves. Rather than waiting for owners to initiate change, we should recognize that strong professionals can drive meaningful transformation. Sometimes all it takes is a clear, principled position to enable major change.
When independent directors act as a united, coherent body, they can effectively perform two critical roles. The first is educational. They explain to the owner, this is how it works, this is how it doesn't, and that's final. Without allowing endless relativistic debates, those debates typically arise only when the supervisory board is too soft, too weak, or overly accommodating to the owner. Clear positioning from the board helps owners understand what is required to enter international markets, what communication standards are expected, what cultural norms apply in investor dialogue, and how feedback mechanisms must function. This, in fact, is one of the key functions of a supervisory board. It gently reshapes, even re-educates aspects of the existing business culture. Because the common reaction is often, but this works here, why should we change? We're a European country too. Why shouldn't we do it our way? Yet we cannot ignore the historical context, decades of systemic influence that shaped how business is conducted. Western partners often negotiate differently. Their expectations and assumptions are structured differently from ours. The outdated mindset of whoever has the money calls the tune no longer works in sophisticated capital markets. If we want to attract foreign capital, we must adapt in communication style, governance standards, leadership behavior, and even in how we treat employees. It requires a different mindset. Investors today will absolutely examine ESG-related policies, including gender equality frameworks and broader compliance standards. They will look into attrition rates, retention programs, governance policies, and cultural alignment before making any decision. All of this will be scrutinized very closely.
Open and honest communication with owners is critically important. Owners are not corporate governance professionals, and their views may differ from established governance standards. That gap needs to be addressed, explained, aligned, and where necessary, corrected. And if a situation cannot be improved, if the owner insists on a specific governance model that fundamentally compromises standards, then independence means having the ability to say, all right, you may continue this journey without me.
Beyond formally documenting roles, areas of responsibility, and functions, I would place strong emphasis on reporting. First comes proper planning. What does the board intend to change, improve, or achieve? Then comes reporting. Annual reports from committees and from the board as a whole outlining what has been accomplished during the year. Not what the company has achieved, but specifically what the board has done, what it managed to influence, what it failed to achieve, and why, based on a clear analysis. Within this reporting framework, I would also emphasize the importance of evaluation. And evaluation begins with self-awareness, understanding whether you are genuinely ready for the role. What are your strengths specifically in the context of the requirements for a corporate director? Where are your gaps? And what is your development plan to close those gaps? Then comes internal evaluation, the board's self-assessment. And at the highest level of governance maturity, external evaluation. But everything truly starts with understanding yourself. Are you ready to serve as a corporate director? Frankly, during programs such as CGPA or UCGA, we were not given a practical checklist to assess whether we were actually ready. And readiness is not only about professional expertise, it is about maturity, integrity, and wholeness as a leader. These qualities are essential for a corporate director. In the course I teach at Kyiv School of Economics in partnership with LMBI, I provide both a structured checklist and, more importantly, a safe evaluation framework. The participants are not yet board directors. They may choose to pursue corporate governance, or they may decide not to. At the end of the course, participants conduct a personal assessment. Are they truly ready for a board role? If yes, what still needs refinement? If not, why not? And do they genuinely want to pursue this path? When I reviewed these reflections and assessment papers, I am convinced that this kind of evaluation should be mandatory for every corporate director. It should take place before joining a board, before formally stepping into the role. Moreover, the areas for improvement should not shrink over time. They should expand. With each year of board experience, you gain a deeper understanding of how much more is required from a corporate director, how much broader your knowledge must be, how much further you must develop, including personally. And again, this is not only about professional expertise, it is about the ability to function effectively within a collective governing body, to collaborate, to challenge constructively, to exercise judgment responsibly.
Colleagues, thank you for such an engaging and thoughtful conversation and for the valuable insights shared.
Thank you very much, Sergiy.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you as well for such a meaningful and substantive discussion. It has truly been a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you on our channel.